Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using the Magnolia Sympathy stamp set by Miss Ink Stamps, as well as the ARTEZA half pan watercolors. So I'm going to start off with my background here, and I have a piece of the ARTEZA watercolor paper down onto my board, and this is cut down to 5 by 3 3/4. Just saturating the entire piece of paper there with water, and then I'm just going to kind of drop in my color. I'm starting off with a base color here, which is a very pale yellow. Then I'm going to mix in some of the brownish tones into the center and kind of just let them spread out on their own. I will take a paper towel and kind of seep up some of the pooling that I have on the edges of the card panel. And you can certainly use a heat gun here to kind of speed up the drying process, but I prefer just to let mine air dry. And you'll see that it does definitely lighten up a lot. Once it is completely dry, I'll go ahead and carefully remove that from my board, and we'll move on to the stamping. I'm going to use my MISTI here because I'm going to stamp each of the images twice. The paper is textured, so you just want to make sure that you're getting a good impression so that you can actually see what you're coloring. So I'm starting off with this larger flower here, placing that onto the lower right hand corner, stamping that twice with the antique linen traditional distress inks, flipping my panel 180 degrees and stamping that twice again. Then I'll move on to the smaller flower, and I'm going to end up stamping this twice on each corner, one on either side of this larger flower. And I'm not doing any masking here. I'm just going to go ahead and ink up the stamp and then remove with my finger just the ink that is actually going to overlap the other flower that's already stamped out. Again, flipping my card panel around 180 degrees and doing that again. I'm going to show you where I placed my leaves, but this is where I had to kind of cut the video out. I had a huge bug crawling across my desk. I had to run out of the room, find the bug spray, came back. I couldn't find the bug. You know how that goes. So I spent about an hour trying to look for this bug, but I finally got it. So once it was dead, we'll move on to the watercoloring itself. So I'm going to start off with all of my leaves, and I'm using a few different greens. I'm going in with a damp paintbrush and picking up some of the olive green and filling in the entire leaf. While it is still wet, or damp I should say, I'm going to come in with some of the cobalt green and just add a little bit of shadowing on the base of the leaf as well as up one of the sides, just to kind of add a little bit of variation in color here. Now you just want to make sure that the leaf is not saturated. So if you notice any pooling on your paper, you want to make sure that you either let it dry or you seep up some of that water. I also mix some of the black with the cobalt green to get an even darker green to have even more dimensions. So I'm basically using 3 different greens here. So starting off with the lightest, the olive green, then dropping in some of the cobalt green, and then going in with the cobalt green mixed with the black for really darker areas. And you'll see that sometimes I'm going back to the leaves. I'm letting them dry for a little bit so that they're barely damp, because I don't want that real dark color to spread too much. So they are still damp to the touch, I guess, if I were to touch it, but they're not completely dry yet, but they're not completely saturated either, if that makes any sense. I'm new to watercoloring, so all of this is completely experimental for me. So once I had the base layer down of the leaves, I'm just going to kind of go through and add a few more shadows and a little bit more dimension to areas that I feel necessary, or areas that maybe didn't dry the way I wanted them to, because it will look completely different when it's dry versus when you're actually working on it. So just because you're not happy with it, just kind of let it dry for a few minutes and see the results that you get, because they will be completely different from what you're looking at right now. So I went back and forth with those 3 greens there to kind of get the dimension and the variation that I'm looking for. And once I'm done with the leaves, I did let my panel sit for about 5 minutes or so, just to make sure that those leaves were completely dry before I moved on to the flowers. You do want to make sure that you're not working on two areas on your card that are wet at the same time. If one area is wet, you got to move on to a different area because those colors will merge in places that you don't want them to merge. So for the flowers, I'm going to be using a few different yellows. And I'm going to start off with the Naples yellow, which is kind of like a golden yellow. Going in with a damp paintbrush and kind of just dropping in that color on my petal where the areas will be the darkest. Then I'll clean off my paintbrush, dab that off onto a paper towel, and spread that color out to the tip of the petal. Next, I'm going to drop in some of the yellow ochre, which is more of a brownish yellow, and I'm just dropping that into the petal when it's still damp, but into the areas that will be the darkest. So my shadows are going to basically be where one petal is laying under another, and a few of these petals are kind of folded over on themselves, and that would also create a shadow. Because my petal is still damp, those colors will kind of blend and spread on their own. Again, kind of letting that go and seeing the results I come up with before going back and adding any more or taking anything away. Just let it dry for a minute or so. And you'll see that some of these petals I do go back and forth to several times if I'm not happy with the results once it dries. Your colors won't necessarily spread all that much if you re-wet it, but you can certainly take a lot of the color away. You can lighten it up and kind of almost start over if you're really unhappy with a certain petal, which I have done. So I'm going to kind of work around these three flowers, moving on to petals kind of scattered throughout, making sure that the petals aren't touching one another. I'm leaving the middles of the flowers blank, I guess, at this point, because I really didn't have a clue what I was going to do with them. For the petals that are folded over on themselves, I'm not painting in that little fold because that would be the very lightest area of the petal because it would be the most raised up. So I'm not even concerned about that yet. Once I have all of my images or image complete, then I'll go back in with my lightest color for those little folded areas. So once these were all done and the petals were pretty much dry, I'm going to go ahead and bring in some of the, I think I use the burnt sienna, which is a reddish brownish color. And I mixed that in with the Naples yellow to make a pretty significantly darker than the rest of my image here. And this is where I'm going to add the very darkest shadows. So the very, very darkest areas of each of these petals. And I'm going to go in with a damp paintbrush and I'm just using the very tip of it. So you want to make sure that you are using a paintbrush that has a pretty good tip. I think this is a number 2 round brush that I'm using. So it is a pretty fine tip. And I'm just going to pick up just a little tiny bit of that pigment and drop it into the very darkest areas. So basically, as if I was Copic coloring, this is where my shading would be. This is where my shadows would be. So I'm going to go in with a very light line, and you can see I'm just adding a teeny tiny bit here. Then once I have that done, I'm going to clean off my brush again, dab that off onto the paper towel so that the paintbrush is only damp and not dripping wet. And I'm going to go ahead and soften those areas out. So I'm not going to spread this color. You'll see that I'm not really spreading it, but I'm kind of going over it with just that damp paintbrush to soften it out. If there's certain areas that I need to spread out a little bit further, I will. But for the most part, I just want these softened. I don't want my flower to be brown. I just want the shadows to be brown. So I also did this where one flower is underneath another, and also for those petals that are folded over on themselves. So did the same exact thing with the other 3 flowers on the other corner, same color combination, same shading and everything, but it is watercolor, so it's never going to look identical. Even if I were to use Copics, it wouldn't be identical. So for the centers of the flower, I still wasn't sure and I still messed it up, but I dropped in the cadmium yellow light, which is a pretty bright yellow, and I just filled in the centers of the flowers with that and then let that dry. I'll go back in later and add some texture to the centers, or let me rephrase that. I'll at least try to add some texture to the centers of the flowers once everything is done. So I went ahead and painted in those other 3 flowers there. And then we're going to go ahead and add some details. So for the leaves, I'm going to bring in some of the fern green as well as some of that black, mixing that together to make a pretty dark green there. And again, just picking up a teeny tiny bit of the pigment with just the tip of my paintbrush and drawing in the veins of the leaves. Some of the veins I can actually still see from stamping this twice. I could have probably gotten away with stamping it once, but on camera, I wasn't sure if you guys were going to be able to see it. Now for the centers of the flowers, I tried to, I don't know what I was trying to do here, guys. I really messed this up. But because it's watercolor, it's very forgiving. So because I was not happy with it and it was still wet, I was able to take a paper towel and just kind of dab that away and get rid of my big mistake that I made there. So I'm going back to my comfort zone. I'm bringing in some Copics and I'm just going to do the centers of the flowers. Like I said, I'm a beginner with watercolors. So if there's certain areas that I'm not comfortable with or I still need practice, I may bring in another medium just to make sure everything kind of looks right. So I'm just adding a few little dots, and then I'm with the YR24 and then bringing in the Y27 just to kind of spread those dots out or blend those dots out just to add a little bit of texture. So once all of that was done, I'm going to go ahead and trim down my panel here just a little bit where my washi tape was holding that down to my board so I don't have any white edges. And then I'm going to go ahead and stamp my sentiment. I'm going to go ahead and bring out my Misty again because, like I said, it is textured paper. Going to stamp my sentiment with dark chocolate ink by Simon Says Stamp. I did end up stamping this twice, although I got a pretty good impression the first time around. Once that was done, I'm going to add some spatters to the background. And I'm just using some leftover paint that I had in the palette and just kind of spattering that all around. Make sure that this is completely dry before adhering this to your card base. And I'm going to pop up my panel with some fun foam. So I have the fun foam cut just slightly large or slightly smaller than my card panel here. And I'm going to bring out my ATG gun, which here's another disaster. Don't know what's going on here. I always seem to have a problem. I don't know whether I have a defective one or whether it's just user error, but I have all of this extra stringy stuff hanging out of it, but I was able to at least adhere the fun foam to the card panel, and I just didn't want to mess with it anymore. So I brought out my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere this down to an A2 size note card, and this is Desert Storm by Nina. And I just placed my Misty on top of the panel just to make sure that that glue really set. It does take a few extra minutes with the fun foam. Once that was done, I'm going to go ahead and bring in some clear Nuvo drops just to add a few around my flowers and around my sentiment, squirting that onto a scrap piece of paper to make sure there's no air bubbles first. But that is it. That is the card for today, guys. I will list all of the supplies below. Thanks so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.